We've got some quick notes for Target 6 today. Remember, if you were absent, if that's why you're watching this video, you probably also missed your quiz over Targets 1 through 5, which means that you will receive your test score. You won't have to make that up, but do make sure that you understand these notes before getting back to school. So in Target 6, it says I can write a linear equation given a graph or a point and slope. So we're going to be working backwards here. I'm going to give you some information, and then you're going to tell me the equation that would represent that information. So we'll start off here with something we already know a little bit about, slope-intercept form, y equals mx plus b. Hopefully you already know that m stands for slope, and b is your y-intercept. And then we actually have a second formula that we're going to be looking at, which is point slope form. This might be one you want to write on your reference sheet just because we're not quite as familiar with that as slope intercept form. M in this form still stands for slope. If you look at the equation, it looks just a little bit more complicated. It's actually not complicated to work with, it just looks that way. Notice you have this x1, y1, and actually what that's going to represent is an x coordinate and a y coordinate. And what I mean by that is whenever you have a coordinate, so let's say the point, I'm just making this point up, 2, 1, that's an x, y coordinate. So x1 would be the x coordinate and y1 would be the y coordinate of that point. So x1 would be 2, y1 would be 1. We'll get into that more, but just kind of understanding what I meant by x coordinate and y coordinate. Okay, so the first thing is I will give you a graph and you'll have to write your answer in slope-intercept form. So something I want you to be careful of on this target is do notice what form your teacher is asking you to write your equations in. So this is slope-intercept form, which is y equals mx plus b, so what we're used to. So in order to do this, we'll need to know two things. We need to know m and we need to know b. So on A, this is a horizontal line, and the slope of any horizontal line is 0. B is the y-intercept, and I know that this one looks like it's at like 4.25, but I think it just that line got scooted up a little bit. I think the intention is that that horizontal line is at 4, so we'll say the y-intercept is 4. So when we go to write the equation, we would have y equals m, which is 0, x plus 4. And that looks kind of silly to have that 0 in there, so what I would probably do is just kind of simplify this to y equals 4, which should make sense going with this graph because any horizontal line that's graphed is, it comes from the equation y equals. So hopefully that makes sense going back to previous targets that we've had. All right, and again, I think that this line got scooched up a little bit on B, so bear with me as I give you some points so it makes a little bit more sense. We're going to still look for M and B, but this one's a little bit more complicated because it's not a horizontal line. So again, this got scooched up, so I'm just making some points and hopefully you can see where that graph was intended to be once I make those points. And so remember, to find slope from a graph, we can just do rise over run, and I can just count that this is down 1 over 1, down 1 over 1. So negative 1 over 1, which we're just going to say is negative 1. And a negative should make sense here because it is going downhill. B is where it crosses the y-axis, and we can see that that's at 4 just by looking at the graph. So our equation is going to be y equals negative 1x, which I'm just going to write as negative x, because remember that is saying negative 1x, plus 4. So we're just going backwards from target 4 that we did previously by writing the equation from the graph. Now, in these, we are going to do something a little bit different. So first of all, we are going to be using point slope form. And in these next questions, we are going to give you some information. So not necessarily a graph, just other pieces of information. So we're going to see how point slope form can be actually really helpful in this case. So A says find the equation of a line that has a slope of 4 and it passes through the point negative 1, negative 6. So notice we don't even know what the y-intercept is, so even if I asked you what's B, we would have to graph this out and kind of guess where B was going to be. So this is why we use point slope form. In point slope form, we need three pieces of information. We need to know what m is, which we do, and we need a point so that we know what x1 and y1 are. So -1 is x1, -6 is y1. So I'm going to go back up to that formula, or think about that formula at the top, and remember it starts with y minus y1. So I'm going to use y as a variable minus y1, so minus a -6. Now if I write minus a -6, that looks goofy because we know that whenever we have minus a negative, that should be a plus. So y plus 6 equals, going back to the formula, the next variable is a 4, or sorry, is m, so it should be a 4, and then parentheses x minus x1. So again, if I subtract a -1, we're going to make that a +1. So just filling in that formula, that new point slope form formula. There is a second part to this question. It says, what's the slope-intercept form? And so we should remember from our previous targets that to get slope-intercept form, you just have to have y equals. So we're going to use our solving skills here. First thing I'm going to do is distribute. So I'm going to leave y plus 6 the same, and I'm going to distribute the 4. And then to get y by itself, we're going to subtract this 6 over, and we have y equals 4x minus 2. So if we were to graph this equation or this equation, they would actually be the same exact line. They would both have a slope of 4. They would both go through the point -1, -6. It's just two different ways to say the same thing. We're going to try another example that's similar, it's just different numbers. So remember, we're going to start off in point slope form, which means we need three pieces of information. We need to know what the slope is, which we do. We need to know what x1 is, which is the x coordinate, so that's -1. And we need to know what the y coordinate is, which is 5. So going back to that formula, it's y minus y1. So y minus 5, I don't need to change that to a plus here because it's not minus a negative. Then the slope is 1/2, parenthesis x minus x1. In this case, I am making it a plus because it would be minus a -1, which would be +1. And then again, we go through that process to get to slope-intercept form. So we're solving for y. I'm going to distribute the 1/2. And then I'm going to add the 5 over so that y is by itself. So we have y equals 1/2 x. And then however you guys want to say this. If you want to say this is 11/2, if you want to say 5.5, if you want to say 5.5, whatever works for you works for me. So I'll say 5.5 because that would be easier to graph. So writing the equation is what we're talking about on target 6.